In this video, we're going to look at the code for partitioning data set and relate that's from table 2.9. So we're going to take a data set and partition into training data set and validation data set. So that'll be two, dividing the data set into two. And we'll also see an example where we will break it down to three sets: training, validation, and test set. Sometimes in some mining methodologies, we may want to divide the data set into three parts instead of just two parts. So once again, I'm going to go through the code that is given in the textbook, and then I'll also show an easier version of doing the same thing. And now when we do partitioning with sample, at least in the educational setting, it is best to do a set seed, right? And within the bracket you put some number, that is whatever number that I give you. Okay, say 1. Okay. And the reason for this is then we start with exactly the same random number stream, so whatever we generate, it is reproducible. In reality, when you're actually doing this, you don't want to set seed to any particular number unless you want to be able to reproduce the results, right? So if you want to reproduce the results, then you need to set seed, and then we are going to do the sample like what we did just in a couple of videos back. What we're going to do is partition data set into, so okay, let me run the seed, and then here we want 60% training and 40% validation. So for example, so what we need to do is to say we want to select train rows, right? And we're going to do sample. Okay. We're going to do sample of what? Row names. Okay. Sampler row names of housing DF. Right. So this is actually a little cumbersome. I'll show you an easier way. Okay. So, and now we have to now select 60% of the total number of rows. So you have to specify what that is. So we want 60% of the number of rows. Remember, in one of the previous videos, we looked at how to get the number of rows. So one way that your textbook does is with dim housing DF, and then the number of rows is in the first position. So this will give us, that part will give us the number of rows, and you multiply by 0.6, and that's the number of rows you want sampled, and those row names will be saved here. Okay, there you go. And then looks like we have to, this code should be here. So we generate the row names actually. Okay, and then we do a train data, right, of those rows. So housing DF. Okay, we want train rows, and we want all the color. Again, housing DF is a two-dimensional data frame. We have rows and columns, so we have specified which rows we want, and then comma what columns you want, And since we want all the columns, we won't specify anything at all. So now we have selected 3481 of all those variables. Now we have to figure out what the remaining rows are, which should go into the validation set. So we have valid dot rows. Okay, and since what we have in train rows are row names, now we can use a function called set diff. Okay, set diff function will take the difference and set it to the valid dot rows. So set diff row names of housing df. So we have to give two things. So what is the whole data set, and then what rows you want thrown out. So that's the second part. All right, so that would be the trained rows. Okay, so now this set diff function will take the row names. So I have a problem here. So you'll take the row names, and I'll take that out. So it'll take the row names and then throw out these names and set the balance in here. So run that. We say valid rows. All right, and then we have to set valid dot data is then housing df valid rows and comma. Okay, so now we have divided the housing.df into trained data and valid data. Okay, now I'll show you an alternative way which is a lot simpler. We don't have to mess with row names and finding the difference and all that. So all we have to do is to, okay, let's call this train dot ind, okay, index. Okay, instead of train rows, we will do train. Well, let's call it train index. Okay, train index. Okay, now we want the train index to be, so again we're going to do a sample. Okay, now we're going to just sample the numbers. Okay, now we want the sample from what? From we want a sample from a sequence of numbers 1 through 5802. So that's the total number of rows, 1 through 5802. So that means we have a function for that, seq length, right? And now if you give a number here, that will generate a series of numbers. So if you want to check this out, say seq len, say if I say 10, right? So it's going to generate numbers 1 through 10. What we want is 1 through 5802, which is the number of rows. So if we say n row, okay, instead of dim and all that, you can just simply say n row housing df. Okay, so that's going to generate a series of numbers starting from 1 all the way through 5802. So that's right there. Okay. And then, okay, we want to specify how many rows we want, right? And we want 60% of the number of rows. So 0.6 times n row housing df. Okay, now that's for that. This is for sequence. Okay, there is a problem here. There should be parenthesis like that. So yeah, the first one is for n row, the second one is for the sequence length. So that means this parenthesis we need to take out. So now what this is going to do is going to select numbers, 60% of the numbers from 1 through 5802. So instead of generating at random row names, we are just simply selecting numbers, right? So you run that. So you have train dot ind train dot index. Okay, there it is. Okay, so it's a bunch of numbers, right? It's not names. So now all we have to do is to train dot data will be housing dot df. Okay, so now you just specify which rows you want, not row names, which rows you want, that is train index, right? And you want all the columns. And valid dot data will then be the remaining. So you take housing df and then you say, okay, remove. So when you do a minus in front, so that's going to remove. So this one is going to select those rows. When you put a minus sign, that's going to remove those rows. So you get the train and the valid data set. So it's a lot easier than doing it with row names. Okay, so now we have the train and valid data set. So this is how you will split a given data set into train and validate, okay, specifying whatever percentage you want. You want 60%, 70%, whatever that you want. You use that here in your sequence, in your n rows times the probability.